From the studios of KPFK Pacifica Radio in Los Angeles, this is Uprising and I'm Sonali. It's Friday, November 14th, 2014. Bhopal, A Prayer for Rain, a new feature film, chronicles the events leading up to the world's worst industrial disaster. We'll speak with actor Kal Penn and director Ravi Kumar. And taking an upstream approach to Ebola as the epidemic continues to unfold in West Africa, we'll be joined by a doctor about how treating the root cause of the epidemic is crucial. Plus, a Walmart worker speaks out about her role in the retail giant's first sit-in. That's coming up after the news. Joining us now to analyze today's headlines is Cristina Mislan. She is an assistant professor of journalism studies at the Missouri School of Journalism. Hi, Cristina.
Hello, Sonali.
Well, the Wall Street Journal has just reported that the Justice Department has been carrying out a secret program to listen in on phone conversations using aircraft equipped with data collection devices that mimic cell phone towers. According to the Journal, the program amounts to, quote, a high-tech hunt for criminal suspects that is snagging a large number of innocent Americans. The program is carried out from at least 5 major airports and covers the majority of the U.S. population. At the local level, Associated Press broke a similar story of the Los Angeles Police Department relying on electronic data collection as part of a program called LASER to focus on ex-convicts in crime-ridden neighborhoods. The AP, paraphrasing proponents of privacy rights, says the spying program, quote, isn't transparent, has no clear oversight, and unjustly focuses on keeping ex-convicts under suspicion even though they've served their time. Now, Cristina, both these programs, national and local, seem to be premised on the idea that you're guilty before being proven innocent. Are you shocked by these revelations?
I am not at all shocked, nor should any of us be shocked. What we're seeing here is starting to see something that the U.S. has long accused other countries of practicing, really is a police state. These two incidents are just more evidence for really showing how surveillance and these issues of being guilty before proven innocent are really becoming part of our everyday lives in both global and national context. Only this time, it's not some other axis of evil. It's actually that the U.S. would like to demonize. It's actually the United States itself. So I think there should come a point where the public should ask, when will we stop allowing national security arguments to not only encroach upon our privacy, if we think we have privacy in the first place, but really our human rights. And we can bring this to issues of mass incarceration, and that is happening there as well, especially in LA, where you have this issue of criminals, or so-called criminals, people we would like to deem as criminals, always being under surveillance. So that's an issue that we have to consider as well.
And following up on his relatively bold climate deal with China, President Obama this morning announced at the G20 meeting that the U.S. will pledge between $2.5 to $3 billion to the Green Climate Fund. The fund is a crucial negotiating point at international climate talks and is aimed at enabling poor countries to transition to cleaner energy sources. The release of the funds still depends on congressional authorization, which of course may be a tough path forward. Still, in simply announcing the pledge, Obama has prompted other wealthy nations to offer similar pledges, and these pledges could kickstart climate talks that are expected to take place later this month in Lima, Peru, and a major climate conference that is to take place in Paris in 2015. Well, Cristina, do you think that with these pledges of funding, we may finally see real action taking place at these upcoming climate talks?
Well, I think we're seeing an improvement, and it's good that we're moving toward these talks, but I would be hesitant to applaud this move, being that we still have issues, for instance, like the Keystone Pipeline that we're still talking about in the U.S. And if we see something like that approved by Congress, and then depending on what President Obama's reaction is, if that is approved, it undermines these talks. So what the U.S. really has to do here is hold not only other countries accountable for providing cleaner energy resources, but also holding itself accountable for doing the same.
And finally, government workers are on strike. More than 800 federal contractors and some members of Congress supporting them marched yesterday on the U.S. Capitol in Washington, D.C., demanding better pay and benefits and access to a union. Among them were Pentagon and Smithsonian Museum workers. It was apparently the first time such a strike took place at the Capitol. And today, U.S. postal workers are demonstrating in more than 100 U.S. cities, including Washington, D.C., against proposed cuts and degradation of postal services. The USPS has long been a target of Republicans, even though it is technically financially self-sufficient. Well, Cristina, how important are such shows of force by government workers? And with the new GOP-dominated Congress coming into power, will they simply brush them aside?
Well, the strikes themselves are definitely important for showing the public's concerns over issues such as unionization and living wages. They also continue an important conversation that was sparked not too long ago by the Occupy movement. So conversations about economic equality are extremely important to have. But I would say it would be no surprise if Congress in January pushes them aside. And I don't think it's just a Republican-dominated Congress. I think in the past we've seen Congress in general and Washington in general really concerned over its own interest. And so there have been issues where the public has supported or hasn't supported a specific policy, but Washington moves to its own accord and to its own interest, and they push those that public support or non-support aside all the time. And that's both on the Republican and Democrat side.
Well, Cristina Mislan, I appreciate your analysis on these issues, and we'll talk to you again next week.
Thank you.
My guest is Cristina Mislan. She is an assistant professor of journalism studies at the Missouri School of Journalism. And we'll have more on organizing and labor in just a moment, taking a look at what took place at two Walmart stores in Southern California after this break. Subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/uprising with Sonali, where you can watch whole episodes of our TV show online and on demand. I'm Sonali Kohatkar, host of Uprising. Walmart workers upped the ante yet again with a sit-in, the first of its kind, at a Los Angeles area store in Crenshaw yesterday. It was the same store where the first protest against Walmart for retaliation took place 2 years ago. And later yesterday evening, workers launched a second sit-in at another Southern California Walmart store in Pico Rivera. That sit-in resulted in the arrest of 23 workers and organizers. The group Our Walmart led both protests and is made up of current and former Walmart workers and union organizers who have organized walkouts and demonstrations over the company's poor labor record for the past 2 years. Yesterday's sit-ins represent an early chapter of protests planned for the holiday shopping season. Joining us now to tell us what happened is one of the Walmart workers who participated in both sit-ins, Evelyn Cruz. Welcome to Uprising, Evelyn.
Hi, thank you for having me.
So can you begin by telling us a little bit about yourself and what motivated you to participate in both these sit-ins yesterday?
Well, I am almost 11-year associate. As of a week ago, I was fired in retaliation for me speaking out. I've been an active member of our Walmart for going on 4 years, and management just kept on retaliating over and over. Putting me in the office sometimes 2-3 times in a week just to, try to intimidate me. But yesterday what happened was associates went out and protested Walmart and went on strike on Walmart to stop these retaliations. We're workers. We're trying to make a living for ourselves and support our families, and Walmart is not helping in that. We don't have consistent schedules. We don't have enough money to live on.
So, Evelyn, were you fired, you think, because of your involvement in Our Walmart, this organizing group?
I've been working there for almost 11 years, and I have never been in trouble. And it started all when I started being very vocal. So, yes, it was in retaliation to my being active in our Walmart.
And what exactly were you and other workers asking for at the sit-ins yesterday? You were basically asking for Walmart to stop doing this kind of thing where they don't not only are firing people, it looks like, but also intimidating them simply for getting organized and organizing, exercising your constitutional right as a worker.
Yeah, that's the whole reason we don't have consistent hours. How are you going to be able to budget your money, or what little bit of money you do have, if you don't know how many hours you're going to be working? Most of the workers in Walmart make minimum wage. You cannot live on minimum wage. I know I haven't been able to.
So what happened yesterday? Can you give our listeners a sense of what the scene was like? You and other workers sitting on the floor of these Walmart stores with tape over your mouths. How did management respond? How did other shoppers react?
The customers are very positive, and they're encouraging of the workers' actions. Management, not so much. They ask people to move around constantly and to try to make them uncomfortable. And when higher management, regional, got there, they started asking people for identification. We're workers. They know who we are. They see us at actions all the time. There would be no need for them to be asking them for their badges, which we had, for our IDs, which it doesn't matter if you have an ID. That's not what identifies you in Walmart. We have a Walmart identification number, and the regional manager had the audacity to ask these people for their WIN numbers. That's what they call it. And then he said, oh, no, every worker has the same WIN number. No, we do not. The WIN number is especially there for you to be identified as a worker.
So, Evelyn, is what happened yesterday at these two stores in Southern California the first wave of what is expected to be major demonstrations around Black Friday, the biggest shopping day of the year, coming up in just a few weeks?
Yes, it is. We would like to invite everybody out to, there will be 1,600, if not more, protests around the country. Please come and join us. You know, people are tired of being intimidated. People are tired of barely surviving on the wages that Walmart pays. You know, Waltons are the richest family in America. They could do better by their employees.
Well, Evelyn, finally, how are you managing? You just said you just were fired, and living on minimum wage has been impossible. And what's your situation right now? How do you explain for listeners the price, the heavy price that you have paid for daring to organize for your rights?
Well, it's going to be a burden on my family, of course, and but I'm lucky enough to have a family who's very supportive also, and I have great coworkers who are also very supportive because they know what it takes to be in these places, and they know how Walmart reacts. And I feel very blessed to have been able to be in these stores and know the people that I have got to know and tell them that there's hope out there. People are willing to support us. So I'm going to keep fighting, and I hope they will too.
Well, Evelyn, we will certainly be monitoring the Black Friday demonstrations as we get closer to that date. I want to wish you the best of luck, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much. And once again, please come out and support us. It means a great deal.
Evelyn Cruz is my guest. She is a former Walmart worker, had worked there for more than a decade, has been organizing with the group Our Walmart, and participated in 2 sit-ins that took place at 2 Southern California stores yesterday. They were pretty historic sit-ins. There had been protests outside the store, but this was the first time that workers actually went and sat and occupied a Walmart store, 2 Walmart stores, that is. This is Uprising. When we come back, we'll take a look at what's happening in West Africa. A doctor who works in South Central will join us, and he might be best equipped to explain how the situation in West Africa can be brought up under control by examining what's happening upstream. Stay tuned to find out more. This is Uprising. I'm Sonali. While the crisis of Ebola has slipped out of the headlines in West Africa, the numbers of fatalities from the deadly disease continue to rise, at least in some countries. Sierra Leone, in particular, has been hard hit with hundreds of new cases in the past week alone. Mali has now reported a second Ebola outbreak after beating back its first. Overall, there have been at least 5,147 deaths attributed to Ebola. Aid groups and governments are fast-tracking clinical trials of drugs in order to get the high fatality rate under control. 50 to 70% of those who contract Ebola in West Africa die from it. Médecins Sans Frontières has taken the lead on 3 different clinical trials. Now, the standard practice in testing new drugs is to administer them to a group of patients and then give the control group placebos. But because of the emergency situation, all patients will be given the actual drugs. Now, meanwhile, nurses and health workers who are on the front lines of the epidemic are up in arms. In Sierra Leone, hundreds of workers went on strike at a clinic protesting low pay. And here in the United States, where there have been only a handful of cases, a 2-day strike this week by tens of thousands of nurses took aim at the inadequacy of their training and equipment in dealing with Ebola. My guest is Rishi Manchanda. He is the president and founder of Health Begins, and he's a physician who has worked for years in South Central Los Angeles. He's also the author of the book, The Upstream Doctors. He joins me in studio this morning. Welcome to Uprising, Rishi.
Thank you, Sonali.
Thanks so much for joining us. Well, what do you make first of these clinical trials? MSF has taken a serious stand. They've been on the front lines of this fight in West Africa, and they're pushing for these trials without control groups. But this is risky, of course. If there are side effects that end up doing more harm than good, there's a major question of ethics, and people could die, but people are dying anyway.
I'm glad you brought up the question of ethics, especially in a crisis moment that we're in right now with Ebola. You mentioned the case fatality rate right now being from 50 to 70%. So let's keep in mind the environment and the context in places like Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Guinea, the 3 most hardest hit countries right now. And think about that question of ethics. The World Health Organization and a host of others actually put together an ethics working group, and it's a long-standing infrastructure to think about questions like this about therapeutics, not just medications and trials for public health crises, for emerging diseases like Ebola, but also for vaccines. And one of the things that emerged out of this process, which I should stress is a process that has included representatives from the hardest hit countries, from Guinea, Liberia, and Sierra Leone, that's been going on for several months right now, has been this emergence of a question about ethics. And what's guided this is the realization that, A, in a moment where there are fatality rates that are this high, is it ethical, for instance, to come into a community and say to a certain set of patients in a clinic, you get this drug and others will get a placebo? In an environment where healthcare workers are actually being assaulted and murdered because of the crisis that's at hand there, and more importantly, in an environment where resources are so scarce, where there's such incredible limitations right now on the systems, the stuff, the staff, In that environment, is it ethical to actually go into a community and say, we'll provide you with, some of you with an experimental drug, knowing that others will receive a placebo? The question, of course, is then, is it going to be effective in identifying information, and revealing what works and what doesn't? And it's important, I think, at this point to go back to the science and realize that while the gold standard is placebo, randomized control trials, where one group gets an intervention, the other doesn't, there are other scientific methodologies that have been used for a long time, for instance, with cancer trials, wherein one group of patients can receive one experimental drug that has already gone through phase 1 safety testing, and another group receives another experimental drug, so that there's still therapy being provided, both experimental.
Right.
But the question then becomes, how do you compare a group of patients to another group of patients, both of whom are receiving this? I think it's also important to go back and look at the specifics of what MSF is doing right now, and I think what they're doing is taking into account all the complexity of what's happening on the ground and doing so in an ethical way that is keeping, to my impression, keeping in line with what is fundamentally important, which is the autonomy, self-determination of the communities themselves.
So as a doctor, you think this is ethically the right thing to do?
I think in this environment right now, it's full of a lot of ethical tensions right now. I think that I'll mention two things that come to mind to kind of bring this home. When we think about the U.S., the healthcare workers and the patients who've been diagnosed with Ebola right now, we've unfortunately had one patient, as we know, who's died of Ebola on U.S. soil, but there have been several others who have survived right now. The ones who, all of them actually received experimental therapies, whether it's whole blood plasma transfusions of antibodies, or it's ZMapp, et cetera. The patient actually, or it's one of the drugs that's actually going to be used in Liberia itself as part of the trials. Every one of these patients actually has received these experimental therapies. And it's important, I think, to also understand that, more importantly, part of the reason that we have such a high survival rate in the U.S. is not because, I would argue, because of the experimental therapies, but because of the vast, deep, robust infrastructure, public health systems, and healthcare infrastructures. And that's exactly what's missing in West Africa.
And I want to get to that. Let's talk also briefly. You mentioned ZMapp. This was one of the drugs given to some of the U.S. health workers who got Ebola. But this is not being tested as part of the clinical trial. Part of it is that it just takes too long to produce. But the other reason that has been discussed in the media is that it's considered prohibitively expensive. And it's amazing to hear that at a time when people are dying. Thousands of people are dying, but maybe they're the wrong people, right? If this was a crisis in Western Europe or in the United States, the term prohibitively expensive would not even enter our discourse because people's lives are worth more than money.
That's right. There's a morbid calculus in place when people start using terms like prohibitively expensive. It reminds us of the times when people use the same phraseology, the same thinking to talk about HIV medications, and therefore the reasons not to provide it to Africans. So we have to be very, very cautious and very, very vocal about that analysis when it's applied to medications, access to medications in places like West Africa or around the world. It's worth noting that the ones who received the experimental therapies in the missionaries and the healthcare workers who were the first to actually receive some of the therapies like ZMapp and others were themselves the expatriates coming in, foreigners coming into West Africa. So you had a lot of Liberians, a lot of healthcare workers themselves who were indigenous to the country, Liberians, Sierra Leoneans, others who said, what's going on with this differential treatment right now? Apparently it's not expensive enough to be able to preclude it from one set of patients who are expatriates. What about us? So there's this, it's clear that that's a horrible kind of calculus to use. At the same time, ZMapp specifically, to be able to do a trial, right, to be able to go through and provide these experimental therapies, you need enough supply.
Right.
If we start, ZMapp supplies have run out. And so part of I think the rationale for choosing the medications is not only based on some of the data specific to the two drugs that are tried in two of the different trials regarding their safety, but also on the fact that there is enough supply. Then there's a big ramp up. I know that there's a push right now to produce more ZMapp as well, but that's far behind where we are with the other two drugs that are going to be used in the trials.
So let's talk about the fact that there are some countries in West Africa where the crisis has hit pretty hard. There are other countries in parts of the same continent, such as Nigeria, which has managed to beat back the crisis. And then, of course, here in the United States, we don't have a crisis. When you have a handful of cases, more people have died of the enterovirus strain this year than of Ebola in the United States.
Right.
And of course, the crucial difference is, as you pointed out, public health infrastructure, but we don't hear enough about that. Now, of course, we're in crisis mode in West Africa, so of course, it's understandable that the people who have contracted the disease are being treated right away. But if we want to look at the long term, no one's addressing poverty. Is the real disease in West Africa poverty?
I don't want to medicalize poverty because I think sometimes that can, but absolutely a root cause of a lot of the problems we're experiencing right now is a lack of three things. An article that came out 2 months ago, I put it nicely, an article written by Paul Farmer and some other researchers from the Harvard School of Public Health in an article in a mainstream journal of medicine here in the U.S. And they outlined the fact that we're missing staff, we're missing stuff, we're missing systems. Understandably, right now, you alluded to the strikes that are taking place, nursing and healthcare workers in both the U.S. and abroad who are arguing for more stuff, more protective equipment. We need more staff. Liberia alone, prior to this crisis, had 53 physicians for a population of 4.3 million. Right. Wow. So in that environment right now, where we're looking at abysmal rates of coverage for enough staff. Not nearly enough of the basic things that we take for granted in terms of stuff. Stuff meaning IV bags, supplies to be able to administer supportive therapy, so the ability to have gowns and gloves. When that is limited right now, clearly there's a problem in the response, and that leads to transmission. This is a very virulent virus. The case fatality rates can be pretty high, but beyond staff and stuff, what's also missing are the systems. And in our analysis and the kind of hyperbolic way we describe Ebola. And it's not, if Ebola came from Sweden, I guarantee you we wouldn't have the same kind of mentality right now that we have about it right now, this kind of panic-driven thing from the dark continent as people are. Right. There's a lot of in structural racism that is deeply embedded in this. But it really is about systems. Do we have the right systems in place? What's happening right now in West Africa, and I think around the world, is this growing call for awareness to say, let's make sure that while we're investing our money, our dollars, our resources in terms of time, media attention on treating Ebola, let's invest just as much, if not more, on building up the infrastructure so that when the crisis does abate, which it will, that we're not left in yet another kind of scarce environment like what has happened in Haiti, right. Or in other places. So
let's talk about this conceptually and how you have how your work in South Central Los Angeles in many ways sort of informs your analysis of what's happening in West Africa. This idea that rather than simply treating the symptoms of these diseases and medical conditions, which we have to do, we also need to be placing emphasis upstream, as you put it. This idea of the upstream doctors, which you consider yourself as one of. What does that mean? And are people taking that view toward the Ebola crisis?
Sure. So I think conceptually the way I think about this work is by going and helping people to understand what I'm trying to communicate here is using the public health parable of three friends who come to a river. And this river is a beautiful scene, but somehow it becomes tragic because they see children in the water screaming for rescue, screaming for need of somebody to jump in the water and help them out. So the three friends jump right in, they rescue these children. The one friend says, I'm going to focus on those children in the water who are about to drown. I'm going to focus on those. And the second friend says, I'll work on building a raft, coordinating the branches together to be able to usher more children to safety. And over time, those two friends, they're doing okay, but more children are coming. There's more children in need of rescue. And the people in the water start getting fatigued. They start blaming the children, like, why aren't you swimming yourself? Why are you still in the water? And over time, they realize that their third friend is nowhere to be seen. And they finally see her. She's swimming away from them upstream. And they shout to her, where are you going? There are children here to save. And she shouts back, I'm going to find out who or what is throwing these children in the water. In healthcare, we have the first friend, we have that downstreamist, we have the specialist, right? We have that person you need when you're in dire straits. We have the second friend, which is the primary care clinician, that raft builder. But we don't have enough of a healthcare workforce that focuses on understanding the upstream causes, like slum housing, like in the work in South Central, or problems with structural racism, or problems with transportation access, lack of access to healthy, affordable foods. You name it, all these upstream drivers are things that we need to be aware of, and then more importantly, to create a system in the clinical practice of medicine that allows us to not just understand them, but then finally link you to the resources to do something about it. In West Africa with Ebola right now, or in South Central Los Angeles, or in my practice right now, I run a clinic for homeless veterans. in any of these settings, and in the settings of a lot of other healthcare workers out there, what we know works best is a system that includes downstreamists as well as some capacity in the system to understand and address those upstream drivers. That's a higher quality of care. And it also turns out to be a better approach because then we're finally addressing root causes. It allows us to bridge this horrible divide that's occurred in the U.S. primarily and that we're seeing replicated in other parts of the world, this divide between what healthcare does and what everybody else does, the social services. So part of what an upstreamist does, in healthcare at least, is to start to bridge that divide, bring back healthcare into the social domain that it belongs in, a civic institution that actually does have some relevance to issues of poverty, issues of racism, issues of structural issues like the built environment.
So as a doctor looking at West Africa, I mean, I of course understand that you're not there, but from your position observing what's happening through the news, what are some broad-based issues that you can see glaring right away that ought to be addressed for the long term, for so that we don't have more crises like this current one? You know, and it's not just, I mean, poverty is a blanket word, but then the very specific aspects of what housing is like for poor folks living in West Africa and in countries like Liberia who are contracting the disease.
So on a structural level, I think it means making sure that every time that there's an aid package, for instance, the president has proposed $6.2 billion in funding to be able to respond to Ebola. A big chunk of that will go towards the response in West Africa. For every dollar that we spend there, I think the demand from the public and from our politicians and from those most affected in West Africa should be how much money will you spend towards building the infrastructure and building not just the ability to recruit resources like people, community health workers, for instance, and recruit physicians and nurses and other staff. But what about building in the infrastructure for sanitation? You know, the ability to make sure that there is enough lighting, basic essentials, right? For every dollar that we spend on this kind of crisis moment in response to Ebola, I would ask that $1 be donated to making sure that there is at least an investment in the infrastructure in place. Otherwise, what we're doing is responding again like that downstreamist, where all we're doing is rescuing at the bottom, again, vital, necessary work, but we're doing so in a way that's actually short-sighted.
And Rishi, do you feel that often our response, our collectively here in the U.S., both the government and even individuals' response to crises like these are based more on the danger that we anticipate to ourselves? So let's throw money at the emergency, but not the systemic issues, the whole picture, which is who cares if West Africans are living in poverty if it doesn't affect us? But it always does affect us, right?
Right. So the root cause of a lot of what's happening in West Africa is absolutely a structural inequities, a lot of the legacy of an incredibly of attrition, of this anemic response to building up infrastructure. So if we really want to do an upstream analysis, we have to address those things. But of course, we all start from that moment of fear. You know, am I going to get infected? Is my family safe, et cetera? I will say that for every moment that I've had a conversation with somebody about Ebola in the U.S. right now, and the valid concerns are there, right? We have to make sure our infrastructure in the U.S. is equipped well enough to be able to respond to somebody and to rapidly respond in the way that Dallas, illustrated so importantly. We have to make sure that we respond appropriately.
Right, because if there is an epidemic, we know who's going to get hit hardest. It's those people who are going to have least access to health care.
That's right.
The people who are uninsured or have the worst insurance. As we saw, the one person who died here in the United States soil was an immigrant who didn't have health insurance.
So, it's absolutely, it's about making sure that we not only part of the analysis then has to be whenever we're in that downstream moment of like, wow, this is a crisis, whether we feel it psychologically, collectively, or personally, right? The question then for all of us in the service sector, right, and from the policy side, and frankly from the community organizing side, is how do we make sure that we respond adequately and make sure that the response includes some investment in thinking about building infrastructure and creating more. I want to leave with one last kind of stat to kind of illustrate the divide here, and this is a part of why I think we respond in this way. In the U.S., compared to all of our peer nations right now, we spend a disproportionate amount of money, as we know, on health care, but a higher proportion is a lopsided ratio compared to social services, right? In 2009, the latest available data, about 9% of our budget was GDP is spent on social services compared to about 16, 17% now, and even higher on health care. In all of our peer nations in the OECD, right, Sweden, for instance, those ratios are inverted. Right? There's more spending on social services than there is in healthcare.
Because you don't need as much spending on healthcare if you spend more on social services.
Precisely.
Well,
and so,
sorry.
so that's exactly it. So if we're able to kind of let's look at the crisis of Ebola, or for instance, what's happening with any number of chronic diseases or acute communicable diseases in the U.S. right now. For every one of these diseases right now, we can think about ways to be able to go upstream, address those social service gaps that exist, so that we can make sure that fewer people have to end up in a doctor's office to get the right thing. What we're finding right now, interestingly enough, is that a lot of upstreamists are filling in the gap that exists between spending on health services versus healthcare. We find healthcare plans, health insurance plans, that are spending money on housing. Health plans, doctors like myself who are passionate now about making sure that we understand what's happening upstream because we need to out of necessity. So you have this interesting phenomenon right now. It's a symptom of this gap where healthcare is itself starting to respond by saying, let's invest more in social services. And that's a sorry state of affairs when you have to wait for the doctor to say, hey, let's call a social worker.
Wow.
Right?
Well, finally, Rishi, what do you recommend for those doctors who are among our audience? We know we have many who listen to and watch the show. If they're interested in learning more, I know that your TED Talk is online, and is there a website for your organization, Health Begins?
Yeah, so healthbegins.org for any health professional interested in trying to become an upstreamist or think about how they can transform their care and make it better. It's healthbegins.org. And we're just one of a group of a growing number of organizations from mainstream medicine to public health who are starting to rally the troops to say, let's try to make this care better, train more providers. Only 1 in 5 physicians in the nation right now feels like they have any confidence to address these upstream issues, yet overwhelming majority, about 90%, say that this stuff matters.
Wow.
We have to bridge that divide. They can start by visiting us, and we can direct them to whatever resource we
That's
can.
healthbegins.org. I also want to recommend your book, The Upstream Doctors. Rishi Manchanda is my guest. He's the president and founder of Health Begins. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Sonali.
This is Uprising. When we come back, we'll take a look at a new film out in theaters now called Bhopal, A Prayer for Rain. Stay tuned. This is Uprising. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. You can subscribe to our YouTube channel right now at youtube.com/uprising with Sonali, where all of our programs are archived online. 30 years ago, the world's worst man-made industrial disaster took place in an impoverished part of India called Bhopal. A chemical factory run by Union Carbide, which is now owned by Dow Chemical, had a major spill, killing nearly 10,000 people in the immediate aftermath and another 10,000 in the years since. Dow Chemical has faced protests by Indian activists and environmentalists for years and has so far refused to take adequate responsibility. Warren Anderson, the CEO of Union Carbide, who was a wanted man in India for his role in the Bhopal accident, died in a nursing home this past September. He was 92 years old. Now, a new feature film about the events leading up to the disaster has raised questions of culpability once more. Featuring Martin Sheen as Warren Anderson and my guest Kal Penn as an Indian journalist eager to reveal the truth, the film Bhopal, A Prayer for Rain, is opening in theaters around the nation. Kal Penn now joins me in studio, and also with me is the film's director, Ravi Kumar. Welcome to Uprising.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Thanks so much for joining us. Well, the film is an incredible film, and as someone who's actually talked to, on this program, survivors of the Bhopal incident, it's amazing to sort of see the incidents fictionalized. Yes. And I want to start, Ravi, with you. You chose to depict the events leading up to the disaster in this film, rather than the aftermath, rather than starting with the disaster. Why did you make that choice?
It's a very important question, Sonali. If you talk to Bhopali people, the survivors, they describe the disaster in two parts. First one is the night of the disaster, and the second is the ongoing injustice. We decided to keep our focus on the first part of the disaster, which is more dramatic to show the people, and also the lessons can be learned. And it's because the second part is actually very good material for a documentary, and excellent documentaries have been made. And the first disaster part itself has got template for the disaster, which is eerily familiar to the British Petroleum Exxon Valdez. We can learn something from it. We decided to concentrate on the first part.
So Kal Penn, what brought you to this project? A bit of a departure from the things that you're best known for. Of course, people know you most from your franchise, the Harold and Kumar franchise, but they also know you from The Namesake, which is one of my favorite films, by the way. What brought you to this project?
So, I enjoy the fact that I've gotten to do these broad comedies, and I love playing those characters, but I wanted to also mix it up a little bit and do something a little more serious. The reason that I wanted to do the film, Ravi actually emailed me the script probably 5 years ago now. And I knew of course, about the real life incidents around the Union Carbide disaster, but I was really impressed at the depth with which Ravi approached the story. So really fascinating, touching on everything from Indian government corruption to corporate greed to the real life human rights consequences of what happened. I thought I was expecting when I started reading the script that it would be through a singular lens, and it wasn't. It was really multifaceted. So then I sat down with Ravi and heard the passion with which he speaks about this, as you just heard, and I said this is something I'd like to be part of. And of course, Martin Sheen being attached didn't hurt either. I was a big fan before that, but really I think having the chance to do something that is a fictionalized adaptation of a story that I thought was important to tell was the biggest reason.
Right. And so, Ravi, speaking of Martin Sheen, the character of Warren Anderson, of course, the character of played by Martin Sheen, is a very important character. He was a wanted man in India. He was clearly culpable, but still he was a human being, and you portrayed him as a human being. And I'm wondering if you can explain the choices that were made by you as a director in your multifaceted portrayal of this person who is easily demonized if you don't examine him as a human being.
I think we didn't want to patronize our audience by giving our version of events. I think we wanted to show his flaws and capabilities and everything, and let audience decide and have a healthy debate afterwards. I think we find after watching the film, people find talking to themselves, each other, what happened, how did it happen. That was our idea. By demonizing him, we would have cut off a lot of audience, intelligent audience. They want to make up their mind themselves rather than filmmakers telling them. That would be easiest route. But it was very difficult because, as you know, I'm Indian, and in India it's very hot topic, and you have to be very careful. But I'm pleased that even Indians, Indian audience, they actually, not like is the word I would use, but they believe in this character and this story itself.
He's believable.
He's believable, and then he did a wrong thing. Because, for example, Carl would know, last week we had a screening where Mr. Anderson's friend, the daughter, came to the screening, and she was in tears watching the film because she thought, she expected us to demonize him, make him, bit Hitler or something, but she was very impressed not the word, but she was quite thankful and gracious about it. So I think we managed to, it's very hard manage to please, not please, but convince everyone.
Well, I think you touched on something. So, having Mr. Anderson's friend's daughter in the audience, basically goddaughter, if I'm not mistaken, that sort of relationship, she seemed really affected by it because, yes, the character wasn't demonized, but by not demonizing a particular character, I think she felt like since it's so multifaceted, it affected her more than it would have. Demonized characters are very easy to distance ourselves from, and I think what Ravi did smartly, and obviously Martin did, was to craft a well-rounded portrayal of how painful certain things are because you see somebody caring about children, and then the next thing you know, they've made this terrible decision that might lead to, 10,000 people being killed. Very, very complex to wrap your head around, and it seemed like that's what resonated.
It's harder to dismiss that
exactly.
than and maybe more conducive to actually taking some action. I want to talk a little bit about the role, Kal, that you play, and I want to play for our audience a clip from the film Bhopal, A Prayer for Rain, where we have a brief initial meeting between the character that you play and an American journalist played by Misha Barton.
You get to pick your headlines and your enemies.
Enemies are like my headlines. Big, relevant, and rude.
So why did they choose Bhopal?
Middle of nowhere and middle of everywhere. Bhopal is at the heart of India. Cheap government land, subsidized water and electricity, railway connections. Simple logistics.
So what do you want from me?
I want an interview. Anderson, the chairman of Carbide, is coming for his free lunch with local politicians. Jobs means votes. They're all milking this cash cow together.
And that's an excerpt from the film Bhopal, A Prayer for Rain. Kal Penn, you play the role of this journalist, this Indian journalist. And your character is not just driven by getting the story. There's a personal connection for this character as well. Tell us about what it was like to play this role, aside from the mustache and the 80s clothing.
I was hoping you were going to mention that.
I like the shirt, by the way, for our listening audience. They can watch it on our
You had to watch his reaction when he saw his costume and jewelry and white shoes, which rarely see, and white. His expression was priceless.
Yeah, I didn't know how he was going to dress before we started.
Right.
But what drew me to the character was this is a guy who's loosely based on a real journalist in Bhopal, a guy named Keswani. Certainly, we've taken some fictional liberties, but he's a really larger than life character. He's really, really broad, very gregarious when the movie starts out, and it seems like he's just interested in selling his newspapers. He's a gossip columnist in Bhopal. Over the course of the film, you realize that he does a real bit of investigative journalism and finds out that this plant is at risk of leaking. Tries to warn people about it, and you realize because of the lack of trust, given his background in gossip columns, nobody believes him. But you kind of slowly realize this really gregarious guy is actually pretty tragic. In the sense that he cares very deeply for his community. Nobody seems to believe him, and he's kind of caught in this really complicated, crazy relationship between the people that he cares about and realizing that they don't necessarily care about him in that same way. And then he just sort of disappears. I mean, he tries to warn people. He rides his scooter kind of off into the night. He survived that night in terms of the real guy. And Ravi knows more about the real guy. But that is one of the things that appealed to me is the fact that you have this seemingly broad character who gets whittled down into to trying to warn people and not succeed.
I think he's a very educated person, very educated. He's got degrees in journalism and philosophy. But the depth is basically he's trying to portray, being sound very ridiculous, which is, I think, for me, it was very good way to portray him.
What was it like, Ravi, to film this movie about an issue that is so emotional? How did the filming itself shed light on an issue that is still ongoing? The story just began the night that the accident happened. The story has not ended because just as many people died from the aftermath, the horrific disabilities, the chemical exposure that has been passed down from generation to generation. Children who weren't even alive when the disaster took place are suffering the consequences of Union Carbide.
I mean, the filming itself was quite emotional experience for us, all of us, especially the actors in front of the camera, because they had to portray. In one scene, for example, in the climax, when we were shooting, the actors had to pretend that they were blinded by the gas and leaving their loved ones behind and fumbling around the dark. And they could wash their face and, have a cup of tea, but, in real life, we realized that was happening that night. So it was quite traumatic, not traumatic, very emotional thing for us. And we had to be very careful. We had moral obligation, responsibility to be true to the characters, events, and historical facts. So it was very thin edge we had to play around, and that's why filming took longer and editing took longer, because we had to take everyone's opinion, including the survivors groups, victims, politics.
So you consulted with
Of course,
activist groups?
from the beginning, yes. All the facts are correct, especially the functioning. And being me myself, a doctor, the forensic evidence. And I went to the hospital, look at the specimen, looking at the pulmonary edema, all these side effects of everything. So we had to be true, because we know we'll be judged for years to come. It took longer, it was an emotional journey, and I won't recommend, because it just takes hard and long. We could easily make a comedy, as you know, we have fun.
Well, nothing worth doing is ever easy or necessarily
but
fun,
you fall in love
right?
with something and you have to
Right.
finish. You know, there's no rationale behind it. You just follow your heart.
Kal Penn, how has this movie changed you? And I know several other actors, some of them have even written about how this movie has personally impacted them. Can you share your experience?
Sure. Yeah. You know, there are different ways. I think certainly the material, right? I think a lot of us relied very heavily on Ravi's research, since he was much more familiar than the actors were. But through that research, really having a chance to meet survivors, particularly in screenings that we've done in New York and here in Los Angeles. So it does impact you. You know, it's a very different movie than some of the other things that I've had the chance to do. It's based on real events. It's fictionalized, but you know, we shot this movie 5 years ago, and I have thought about it often, especially when we see things like the BP disaster, you know, happen in the Gulf, and realize, wow, these things do keep happening. On the flip side, there are, you know, in terms of regulations, we've talked in a couple of screenings. You never know which ones have been prevented because of better oversight, right? So it's a very hard thing to kind of analyze, but it definitely affects you as an actor if you do a film like this. But then on kind of a positive side, also shooting. This is the first film I've shot entirely in India. I'd never been to Hyderabad, where we shot the majority of it. So having a chance to meet, you know, really young emerging filmmakers in a country like India was very exciting.
Did you have to brush up on your Hindi?
So, well, the biggest thing I probably
He lied
learned.
to us.
These guys lied to me. When I read the script, it was in English. When I rehearsed, it was in English. Rehearsing in LA on my own. I show up in India to start shooting this project, and I do the first reading of the first scene, and the director looks at me and he goes, okay, abhi Hindi mein, which means, okay, now do it in Hindi. I'm like, well, I don't speak Hindi. I speak English as my first language. I speak Gujarati fluently, but I don't speak Hindi. And sure, Hindi and Gujarati are maybe like Spanish and Portuguese, but that's still a big difference. So I had to. They were very kind to hire a dialect coach and teach me how to.
Imagine it was
Hindi.
hot, sweaty on the set with like a lot of cameras and lights, and he was stuck in this polyester shirt, sweating,
Polyester,
with jewelry.
yeah.
And the mustache and all this makeup. He was sweating and he was looking at me. I'm stuck in a very bad Bollywood film.
So
Thanks for trusting. I mean, Martin Sheen, he came all the way. I'm a first-time director. They trusted the script. I think that's what drew them to India, and with me, first-time director.
So Martin Sheen, Kal Penn, Misha Barton, an amazing cast, and of course the Indian actors, among them Tanisha Chatterjee and others, who really bring a gravitas to this film. And I'm wondering, let's talk a little bit about what your intention for this film is, because ultimately, what this film to me showed was how you see essentially profits being put over people's well-beings, and the one and only goal of a corporation is to make a profit. They're bound legally to make a profit. The only thing standing in the way of that is government regulation. The only thing that protects people, workers and residents, is our government stepping in to say, no, you can't cut corners. No, you can't stop spending money on the freon that's required to cool your chemical factory so that if there's a leak, etc. Is this ultimately a story about that? Because you mentioned earlier Exxon Valdez and BP. This sort of stuff keeps happening, and it could happen in India again.
No, I think, first of all, I must emphasize, we are not anti-corporation themselves, because they are fabric of society. They make money, but they also advance science.
They have to be held back, though.
They held back responsible. What happened in early 80s in India was post-colonial times. When the white people, Caucasian people come and make a factory, we didn't ask many questions. I think accountability was the issue, and corporate governance. They don't go out corporate that, okay, we are going to kill people.
Sure.
I think the accountability was lack, and politicians didn't ask questions because they were subservient.
So are they asking questions?
I think we should ask
today?
questions. Yeah,
right.
That's the whole point. That's why we made this film. We should ask them questions, hold them accountable to the subject. It's not that they are doing bad things. They need to. Even the democracy has a position for the same reason. opposition is there to ask questions, so it's guided properly. It's like every car has to have brake.
Right.
So accountability is more important.
Right.
And corporate, we are not against corporate. We are not saying corporate actually did bad things. We are as fault as they are. We did ask questions.
Right. A combination of government oversight and regulation with a corporation doing business can protect everybody.
Yeah.
So the question of who is holding corporations accountable in India today, we still have companies like Coca-Cola, and of course, no one's really compensated people enough. And I'm wondering if either of you have an opinion on our new government here in our new government in India. I forget sometimes I'm in the United States. My own Indian background reminds me that. But Kal Penn, your fellow Gujarati now
exactly. Ask him.
Is in power in India.
Yes.
Prime Minister Narendra Modi, who seems eager, like his predecessors, to roll out the welcome mat to corporations and foreign investors. And I'm wondering if you were at the rock concert that he held at Madison Square Garden in New York earlier this year. But is there any indication that he's going to hold corporations like Dow Chemical, which owns Union Carbide, accountable?
We hope so, because I think the change, we can see the change happening right now, especially with Amnesty International lobbying Mr. Modi, Bhopal medical appeal, and they have been doing groundwork for the last 30 years. And I think government is making it. I think there's a plan in the air that clean up the place and remove the factory from Bhopal ground itself.
Right.
So there's a change, and also I've been told there's been safety precautions in place for Bhopal, to avoid Bhopal from happening again.
Right, right. And Kal Penn, as a former White House staffer, I'm wondering if you can pull your strings with the president as well to make this a priority, because of course, who is looking out for poor Indians, right? Who is looking out for those people who are poor in Bhopal? And I'm wondering, finally, last thoughts for both of you. What do you hope most to come out of this film here in the United States? Union Carbide, Dow Chemical, these are American companies. I mean, they're multinationals, but they do business here in the United States, and we have power as consumers and as government, as citizens and as taxpayers. What's your hope for the film?
I'm glad you brought that up. You know, in a lot of the discussions after the film, you know, I think Ravi smartly, as I mentioned before, really focuses on certainly the corporate greed aspect, but the government corruption and personal corruption that still exists in India. I mean, we shot this film in India. We've been to India to promote it. You can't go to India for business without seeing vast corruption happen everywhere. So when you're looking at, you know, sort of government corruption accountability on both the corporate side, humanitarian side, it is a really broad picture that I think Ravi's done a great job at painting in the film. You know, we had some screenings. We opened in New York last week. We opened in Los Angeles tonight. And the audiences, particularly American audiences, seem to be walking away from the movie with anger a lot of times, saying we had no idea that this was really based on real life events. You know, how can situations like this keep happening? And then get into really passionate conversations about the role of the individual in you know, either acquiescing to things like corruption or lack of regulation, who we vote for, of course, the debate between major parties and third parties, and what's most effective in holding both individuals and governments and corporate entities accountable.
So it's starting
Fascinating
the conversation. There we go,
Yes,
and there you've accomplished your goal. We will post to our website, uprisingwithsonali.com, where you can watch the film. There are going to be screenings attended by my guests and Martin Sheen. This is Uprising. Bipasha Shom is our producer and program director. Michael Casey is our research intern. Christian Beck and Camilo Ramirez are our production interns. And Dan Swerdlove is our technical director. Teddy Robinson and Jonathan Alexander are our audio engineers. Special thanks to Anna Buss for help with our YouTube channel, which you can find online at youtube.com/uprisingwithsonali. Our website is simply uprisingwithsonali.com. Our theme music is by Quetzal. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar, host and executive producer of Uprising. Have a wonderful weekend. I'll see you Monday.